Greetings, adventurers. This is DM Kurt coming from the Grognard's Garage, and today's subject is 5th edition. Is it complicated? Well, I recently heard somebody online saying that 5th edition was complicated. Okay, well, let's take a look at that. So what I did is I took 1st, 2nd, and 5th edition and went through them and tried to determine which is more complicated to work with. So we got notes. Now, to start off with, I figured the only fair way to do this is to do a point system. Every time something's more complicated in one edition than another, we'll give it a point. So where do we start off with? Well, let's start off with making up a character. All 3 editions use a dice method. In 1st edition, you have multiple dice methods that are all in the DM's guide because they had a slightly different philosophy back then. You had a very thin player's handbook and a thick DMG because the DM ran the game, ruled the game, and was expected to be the font of knowledge for everything. So I'll have to have read through the DM's guide to pull some of the information out for the 1st edition stuff. Now, with all 3 of these editions, we have a dice method for coming up with your stats. 5th edition gives the option of a point buy or something called standard array. With standard array, everybody at the table has the same amount of points in their attributes arranged in a method of their choosing. They have a 15, an 8, and several numbers in between. Choosing your race and class. Now, 5e had more options. I don't think it's terribly complicated to have more options in just a list of, say, 12 to 14 character classes versus like 4 to 6. It's just a matter of choosing one off of a list. So I didn't add that in. However, with 1st and 2nd edition, you could multi-class having 2, sometimes 3 classes at the same time, starting at 1st level, if you were of certain non-human races, such as elves, or perhaps dwarf or halfling. So that kind of got a point for complication in that humans were single class only. Some of the demi-humans were multi-class, but not all, and they had different multi-class options depending on which demi-human race we're talking about. Now, for demi-humans, that was defined as any of the non-human races to include elves, dwarves, halflings, half-orcs, etc. In 1st edition and 2nd edition, you had to choose your alignment. In 5th edition, you have to choose a background. Those are totally different things, but they're each something that's important for your character later. 1st edition had gender and race maximums for your stats. So if you were a female halfling, your strength could be no higher than 14, male halfling no higher than 17, etc. So racial maximums that came into play for 1st and 2nd edition. They do not in 5th. So I'm going to give that a point for both 1st and 2nd edition for adding these maximums that only certain characters have, and some of them do, some of them don't. So that makes things more complicated. Also, for complication, if you're a fighter, you have a different strength score than everybody else. With everybody else, your strength attribute can be between a 3 and an 18 because you, in theory, rolled 3d6 or some variant thereof where you got the equivalent of 3d6, such as 4d6 and just take the best 3 out of 4. No, in 1st and 2nd edition, if you were a fighter and you got an 18 strength, you got to also add a percentile at the end of that. So you'd roll your percentile, and each classification above 18 was a different set of bonuses for your fighter. So you could have an 18 strength if you're a thief or a cleric. You could have an 18 slash 01 to 50, 51 to 75, 76 to 90, 91 to 99, or double odd. Each of those ranges being an additional set of attributes. So that is also part of the point that 1st and 2nd edition got for complication. We had age effects in first edition. If you were old or elderly, you could have bonuses to wisdom or intelligence, but penalties on strength and constitution, which is based on the assumption that your character will actually live that long. Quite often, it'll just die in combat and you're done. We have no such chart in 5th edition. Subclasses. Now, in 1st edition, we didn't really have much only of subclasses. We said that illusionists were a subclass of wizards. Magic users are called them. Bards were a whole other situation. I'll get into that later on. Paladins and rangers were subclasses of fighters, but they weren't a split off of the class. They were their own separate classes within the same family. 2nd edition, you would pick your class, and you may or may not grab one of the supplemental splat books, such as this one's for the wizards, where you would add kits to your class, which would give you a little more flavor. They'd give you a few bonuses and a few penalties. It was just to make things more interesting for your particular class, so that you could have 2 separate wizards who are not illusionists, but yet have different powers and abilities. In 5th edition, you have to take a subclass. You have to pick one. Whether it's a paladin who has to make his choice of which oath to take, or whether it's a priest who has to pick his choice of domain of spells that he picks. It's mandatory, and they all add something to your character to differentiate it, but they also add more powers. It's not a optional plus and minus that's you're totally balanced without it. It's mandatory and you get something. Weapon proficiency. So with 5th edition, it's pretty simple. You pretty much either get proficiency in about half the weapons, all the simple ones, or you get proficiency in all the weapons, because a fighter or someone like that is going to have a lot of weapon skill. Or you may be an oddball that has a very select list, but it was different in the old days. With 1st and 2nd edition, skill with each individual weapon was an additional skill you had to pick up. You could have fighters who could use long swords and didn't know how to use a spear effectively. And the fun thing was, if you're not proficient in the weapon, you get a penalty to hit. And that penalty to hit varies depending on your class. That was for 1st and 2nd. 5th, it goes the other way around. Nobody gets a bonus to hit with a weapon other than their attribute. And if they get a bonus from being proficient in it, but there's never a penalty for non-proficiency. It's either 0 or plus, as opposed to before, whether it was you don't get a negative from not being non-proficient. If that makes any sense. 2nd edition ended up with adding what was called specialization, where a fighter, at a fighter only, could spend multiple proficiency slots, because he had to get proficiency slots, a certain number of them, to spend in his weapons. If you spent multiple slots in one weapon, you could get bonuses, which was an optional rule, but quite handy. So we come to non-weapon proficiencies. With 5th edition, there are 18 non-weapon skills. That's it. And they're in the player's handbook. They're on the basic character sheet. You either have the skill or you don't. And most situations you come up with will go up against one of those skills. Whereas in 1st and 2nd edition, there were a limited number of non-weapon proficiencies you could get. Which proficiencies you were eligible to take varied depending on your class. And if you tried to take a proficiency such as wilderness survival for a wizard, it would cost you double the number of non-weapon proficiency skill points. So, complication point for 1st and 2nd edition. With magic, I find that the magic system is pretty similar across the board. There's generally only 3 types of spells. There's the spells where you have to roll to hit, the spells where it works against the target, but the target has to get a saving throw to avoid taking the damage or taking the effect. And there are the third class, the spells that just simply work. The spells that just simply work are usually not against an opponent. Things like Dig, where you cast the spell and a certain trench line is already dug out for you, saving yourself hours of backbreaking work. Now, I had to give 5th edition a point on complication because it has an additional option. A lot of 5th edition spells have the ability to be upcast. If you take a 3rd level spell and you burn a 4th or 5th level slot for it, then it may get an additional amount of power added to it. A fireball that you cast, normally at 3rd level, cast your 3rd level spell, fireball, boom, 8d6 damage thrown. Or you say, well, I want to use my 5th level slot for this. Okay, you're 2 slots above, take your 3rd level spell, cast it at 5th level, and you're going to do 10d6 with it. It's an extra option. Also, you do have some meta magic with sorcerers where they can do sorcery points where they can modify existing spells or trade the points directly across for additional spell slots usable in a day. So there's 1 point going into the 5th edition. Some of your class abilities were different in the older editions than in the new one. So with Thieves, you had a skill chart for your various skills. They were pickpockets, open locks, find and remove traps, climbing walls, read languages. And with these 8 skills, you had percentages. Your percentage in each skill varied depending on your race, your dexterity, and the type of armor you're wearing at the time. And as you went up in levels, such as in 2nd edition, you could get bonus discretionary percentage points to throw into these as you went, as well as the percentages just going up on their own in 1st edition. Whereas in 5th edition, they look over your character sheet under your normal skills of sleight of hand, persuasion, acrobatics, and stealth, which are already on the sheet, and you simply are assumed that you're going to take proficiency in those skills. And most of your thief, rogue type things can be boiled down into a handful of things that are already on your sheet, and you don't have to have this additional chart. 1st and 2nd edition were big on additional charts. For Bards, ouch, that one hurt. So in 1st edition, there was no real Bard class. It was in there, but it had to be done a certain way. First, you'd have to start off as a fighter, and then you play a fighter for levels 1 through somewhere in the 5 to 9 range, your option. And then you had to switch character classes to a thief, play a thief up to class 5 through 9, somewhere in your option. And then you had to find a druid, at which point you would switch over to becoming a 1st level bard under the tutelage of the druid. That is a very complicated career path. 2nd edition and beyond, they just said, hey, you want to play a bard? It's a character class by itself. Boom, level 1, start off as a bard. And bards are actually pretty common and popular nowadays in the 5th edition game. It's a very versatile class. You can build it different ways with what you change. The experience points charts. I gave it a point for complication for 1st and 2nd edition because with the experience points charts for 5th edition, everybody, same XP equals same level. In the older games, Thieves had the easiest XP chart to go up just a few thousand XP and boom, you're in the next level. Whereas magic wizards had the hardest XP chart to use because it would take them forever and a day to get a level. Clerics had a separate XP chart, fighters had a separate XP chart. And then if you have a high enough attribute score in your primary attribute for your character class, strength for fighters, intelligence for wizards, you could get a 10% bonus on all of your XP to make it easier to climb that XP chart. So when the DM is handing out experience points, for those of you who have a high primary attribute, you get a different number than people who don't. Didn't make sense to me. I thought that maybe it should be wisdom across the board because with a higher wisdom, maybe you learn things better. You consider your previous experiences and go accordingly. But 1 point for complication, first and second edition. That's a ding on you guys. Initiative. Initiative was probably the easiest in first edition. Initiative is not in the thin little book for the player's handbook. You had to have your DM tell you how to roll initiative. The entire party would just throw one dice, a d6. The DM would roll a d6 for the other side, and best roll wins, and everybody goes pretty much simultaneously. In 5th edition, everybody rolls 1d20, adds their dexterity bonus and any other applicable bonuses that they may have due to special feats or something, or class features. So with 2nd edition, it got a little more complicated. Everybody rolled a d10, subtract your positive bonus and add your negative bonus for your dexterity. Low numbers are best, so 18 dexterity gives you a +3 bonus to initiative. So you roll a d10, then subtract 3 because you're subtracting the bonus. You would add numbers depending on the weapon you're using for the weapon speed factor, and you would add onto that for the casting time of your spell. A fireball was a 3-segment spell, so if you rolled a 2, then you could get to casting on 2s and have it go off on 5s. And if you got hit in between, your spell's disrupted. So that's how spells were disrupted. I'm going to have to give a point each for, well, just a point for 2nd edition for the complicated initiative. Rolling to hit, here's where it kind of gets ugly. In 1st and 2nd edition, they used a decreasing armor class. The better your armor, the lower your armor class number is. So, which is counterintuitive, and that's why THAC0 was kind of a problem. So, if you want to roll to hit, you roll your d20, you add whatever applicable bonuses that you yourself as your character get, and then whatever other modifiers for the situation at hand. The easiest one is invisibility. You have a -4 to hit the invisible person. Thick fog, you have a -2 to hit, but that would not necessarily stack with invisibility because they're both vision based. So you roll whatever adjusted number you get. Let's say you get a 17. Then you find your appropriate THAC0 chart for your class, which you probably have just written on your character sheet. Each class used a separate THAC0 chart. So you would find your chart, which bases on level and class, see what at 17 hits. Maybe it hits AC 0, maybe it hits AC -2, maybe the adjusted roll hits AC 1. Then you tell your DM, hey, I hit this AC or better. Okay, good. 5th edition, much easier. You have an ascending armor class. Everybody starts at a 10 and goes up, whereas before you start at 10, go down. So it's d20 plus your die number. And then that's the AC you hit. If you have a 10, you add 2 for strength, 3 for proficiency. You get a total of 15. You hit anything with an AC 15. Easy peasy. So between the reverse AC and the THAC0 charts varying by class, I'm going to give 2 points to 1st and 2nd edition. Rolling to damage was a little different. I'm not going to give anybody any points for this. It was just done differently from one edition to the other. Roll your dice for damage. Add your bonuses. With 1st and 2nd, your weapons may do more damage or less damage depending on the target's size, whereas in 2nd edition, or 5th edition, it's mostly your weapon does different damage depending on whether you're using it one-handed or two-handed. You just use the next higher die. A longsword, 1d8 or 1d10 of damage. Saving throws. Okay, 1st and 2nd edition, everybody had a different saving throw chart. You would be saving against the type of attack that's being used against you, and there was an order in which they went. If the spell or effect doesn't say what you're saving against, you have to go in order of paralyzation, poison, or death magic, petrify, polymorph, rod, staff, wand, breath weapon, or spell. And it varied by class. So a wizard would have a better chance saving against spells, but poor chance saving against breath weapons, and vice versa for a fighter. This was complicated in that manner. You usually didn't get much in the way of bonuses. 5th edition, pretty straightforward. You don't see that additional chart. They pulled a chart out by simply having your saving throws just go against your attributes. You are making a strength save. If somebody's casting Entangle upon you, can you burst free of the vines before they trap you? Your saving throw is dexterity based against a fireball. Can you dodge out of the way to take half damage? And with only having 6 characteristics that are already on your sheet because you already have your attributes, you don't add anything else cluttering up the page. And fun thing is every class has 2 of these 6 attributes in which they are extra proficient in. It's usually their primary abilities, so that they're extra good at saving against effects that target their particular point of strength. So 1 point for 1st and 2nd edition for saving throws being complicated. Now, there is a little bit where 5th edition is actually more complicated than 1st and 2nd. It's not enough for this whole scoring system to push it into 5th edition being more complicated. But 5th edition does have some complications. Rests. With 5th edition, you have a pool of hit dice as you go up in level. Whatever hit dice you rolled to get your hit points as you went up, well, you also have a pool of dice to play with for when you take a short rest, usually about an hour after a fight. You can spend from this hit dice pool to heal yourself. Makes healing really easy, but then people ask, well, why am I spending my hit points to get my hit points? Eventually they get it, but it is something that happens. And of course, this pool refreshes overnight. And overnight is a long rest of approximately 6 to 8 hours, where you heal everything. All your hit points damage, all of your expended spell slots, everything is refreshed over the course of a long rest. Makes it really easy. Overnight, boom, everything's done. Unless you use some alternate rules on that. Short rests, about an hour. Some character classes, see your monks and warlocks, will get some of their expended resources done back up. So key points for the monk, some spell slots for the warlock, who's really starved on spell slots, to tell you the truth. So, point for 5th. Also, the other point for 5th edition being complicated, I'm going to score 1 point on the board for what you can do in a round. In a round, in 5th edition, you can do movement, and you can split your movement. Say, I want to move 20 feet this direction, do a thing, and then continue to move 10 feet. If you have 30 total feet of movement, it works. You get your regular actions. Usually your regular type actions are cast a spell or attack or something similar to that. You can get a free action if it's a so totally short thing like, oh, I'm just going to drop my sword. Free action. Bonus actions. There are some abilities, class features, spells, etc. that go off on a bonus action. Reactions. The spell Featherfall is cast as a reaction. It is a reaction to falling. And boom, the spell goes off Featherfall. Assuming you wanted to cast it, which you probably do because falling causes damage. Bonus actions. Bonus actions are just one additional action you get on another type of amount of action in a round. And there's only some spells or some class abilities that say in a bonus action you can do this. So in every round you can do your movement, regular action, bonus action, free action, reaction. And you don't know if you have a free action or a bonus action unless you have abilities in your class or in your spell list that say this thing occurs in a free action. This only takes a bonus action for its casting time, etc. But adding up all the points on my handy dandy sheet, the winner for least complicated of the 3 editions is 5th edition. So to the fellow who said that 5th edition was complicated, I would say I respectfully disagree, and I think that complication is perhaps part of just the initial learning curve of each edition. If someone were to start with 5th and go to 2nd, they'd find it intensely complicated. And I myself, who went from 2nd to 5th, I found the initial learning curve to be a little bit of a shock, but then I got to it and it was cool. Thanks all adventurers out there. This is DM Kurt signing out. Please let me know in the comments. Give me a like, a subscribe, and if you disagree, we can chat it out. Thanks. Bye.